Good afternoon, everyone. This is Sydney. I'm Sydney Hargrove, President of Philanthropy Network Greater Philadelphia, and it is my honor really to kick off this conversation today, Philanthropy's Imperative, how to discuss white supremacy with staff, boards, and nonprofit partners. Before we get started, I'm going to yield to Shira Hodges to give a few meeting details and logistics, and we'll get started.
Hi, everyone. I will try to be brief. I realize I'm between you and an amazing conversation that's about to happen. I did want to give a big thank you to SBP Philadelphia for their support today. SBP Philadelphia is a philanthropic network of engaged cross-sector leaders that are committed to reducing poverty in our region. And by leveraging resources and investing in collaborative solutions, SBP Philadelphia connects social impact organizations with people who want to give not just money, but their professional skills and time. They're powered by our local United Way, and SBP Philadelphia is part of the SBP Global Network, which is made up of 3,500 philanthropists in 52 cities worldwide. If you're interested in learning more about them, follow them on Twitter at SBP Philly or contact SBP's Managing Director, Jen Gleason at jen@sbpphl.org. If you want any further information, you can also email me and I'm happy to provide that to you again. So some logistics for today. As you have seen, as you enter this meeting, you're being placed on mute. When we get to the question and answer portion, feel free to unmute yourselves to ask a question. There's also two other options for asking questions. You can obviously feel free to add your question to the chat, or you can direct questions to Kathy or myself if you want to do so privately. And then Kathy will also be sharing a link to the Google form she has created that you can use to submit questions anonymously. And those questions will be read out loud by Kathy at the Q&A portion. Back over to you, Sydney.
Great, thank you so much. So it is my pleasure to bring this moment to have this time with Marcus Walton, President and CEO of Grantmakers for Effective Organizations. I have known Marcus for quite a while. We've been connected in and out through the last few organizations that we were connected with. So it just gives me great joy to welcome him here to Philanthropy Network. And Marcus, I also want to virtually welcome you just to get us started, and as well to the greater Philadelphia area. So this place where the ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were inked in the forming documents of this country, but at a time when you and I, if we were there, would not have been considered human. Indigenous people were not considered citizens, though they were already here, and women did not have a voice. And so I think that it's good to kind of center around the fact of where we are, and certainly use that as part of the context today. So this conversation in some way is really one step between closing the gap between these ideals that we've heard and the experience of Black, Indigenous, and people of color today. So before we get started though, I'd like to do something I call setting the table. For those of you that know me somewhat well, you know that I am from North Carolina, and in North Carolina, certainly in our family and in our household growing up, the role of setting the table was really important. It was more than just simply sitting down, laying down the utensils on the table. It was very much about creating the right atmosphere for engaging dialogue and discussion, right? And so even though we're in a virtual space and we're not able to really sit down at a table and have this conversation together, we want to do our best to try to mimic that atmosphere so that you all can feel engaged, but also feel the opportunity to really ask questions and be a part of it. And so Marcus, I'd like to really give you the opportunity. What do you believe are the key elements of setting the table for today?
Whew. Thank you. These are some historic times, right? Understatement of the year, right?
Yeah.
I'm appreciating this invitation. And so like any guest, I want to make some promises. One promise is that I'll only speak from my experience. So I won't be telling you my opinion as much as I'll be sharing what I've learned through experience to demonstrate promise and produce results that were satisfactory. Right? The other is that I'll operate from integrity. Integrity is connected to sharing the things that are sometimes uncomfortable. We'll talk about what I don't know, out of a belief that the not knowing actually is in service of what is emerging from this moment. And I'll also bring my entire self into this conversation. And so not just an intellectual experience, but truly being present with you in this moment to reveal what is inherent, what is dormant perhaps beneath the surface within our collective genius. There's a true belief, my truest cultural expression is one that suggests that our collective genius has everything that we need in any given moment. And it's up to us to tap into that with each other and reveal that thing. So the table we're setting is for revelation.
Great. Thank you so much. So you've been at this for a while. You still look like a very young man, but
well, except for you've been.
But you've been at this for a while, trying to, thoughtfully, soulfully center racial equity in philanthropy. Serving as, Director of Racial Equity and Training and COO at ABFE, to leading racial equity initiatives at Borealis Philanthropy, and now at GIA. Before we get into the actual topic, just tell me, how does this moment compare to your experiences prior to now?
No, thank you. I have to be honest. I started off as a community organizer, and this was before former president made it cool to be an organizer. Right? Still, when people wonder, what is that? Even my family members and parents would just be confused. And so the important thing about that, though, is organizers engage in some very specific ways of engaging in the world. We're about understanding the power dynamics of situations. We're about understanding the relationships, the ways in which people are situated to influence decision-making in a manner that impacts the quality of life for a broader group of people. And so I entered the philanthropic sector as a practitioner, grant maker, with an organizer's mindset. And so it's something that I've never stopped doing, and you'll hear. And so that has informed why a place such as GEO, which is a philanthropy serving organization, is a place where I've chosen to really, hopefully, leave a legacy that resonates in some way and reflects the power of our collective genes. Because I truly believe the ways in which we are all collectively situated today can be organized in such a way, coordinated to influence decision-making toward our collective interests. Mm-hmm. Today, we don't have, I am not aware of common vision for the philanthropic sector for effectiveness. So what is our vision? But I was raised in Cleveland, Ohio, to understand that without a vision, the people perish. And so my experience today is that we continue to experience unsatisfactory results from our collective efforts in some way due to a lack of a common vision for our sector. We're being guided by all types of other things, including fear. And so the only other thing I'll add there, Sydney, is that after leaving from practicing as a community organizer, I actually started at the Cleveland Foundation. That's something that is not always known. And as an officer for community responsive grant making at the Cleveland Foundation, I was immersed in the most comprehensive education possible within an institution. Cleveland Foundation is the first foundation, like the first community foundation established. And so it's well regarded, and the systems are just second to none, perhaps, in terms of the history and the training that was possible. And at the same time, I experienced all of that as troubling and frustrating, because there were barriers between my ideals to Sydney's framing and the experiences of the people we were serving in ways that were counterproductive. And so I didn't have the language then, but now I understand that to be structural barriers, which we can talk about a little more later. And so the difference between those years and now is that I understand this thing called racial equity, this body of work that suggests that there are barriers that exist in the policies and practices that govern our experiences within our institutions. And so they are unspoken in many ways. And because we're following them as institutional norms, we're actually following a course that has proven to be ineffective over and over again historically. We have not intervened and replaced those policies and practices with different ways of conducting business within our sector. And I believe until we do so, we can anticipate yet another cycle of racial atrocities or political unrest, similar to what we've experienced today, what we've experienced 30, 40 years ago, what we experienced 100 years before that, et cetera, et cetera. It feels and looks different, but essentially it's the same. And so I'm appreciating this conversation because you have disrupted a pattern. Before, I've experienced safe spaces in philanthropy. Brave spaces, nah, that's new. That's new. That's why I'm to.
Well, it's interesting. I think I wrote down here unspoken barriers as institutional norms. Perfect segue to introducing the topic for today, and that is, having conversations about white supremacy. Now, here's the thing. We are, I think, for the most part, in philanthropy, nationally, certainly, hopefully, locally, regionally, we're used to hearing the words racial equity. At least we've gotten used to it in most recent times. Certainly used to hearing diversity and inclusion. Yet, I believe, if I'm honest, the mere mention of the words white supremacy immediately heightens anxiety.
That's right.
In us all. Some believe it is divisive. Some may believe that it should be reserved to describe cross burnings, white hoods, and hate. Yet we are learning now, and certainly many of us have started to engage in the reality that white supremacy is not about being a bad person or a good person, or having good intentions or not. So from your perspective, trying to connect the two, can you unpack the term white supremacy or whiteness as it relates to the pursuit of racial justice, racial equity, liberation?
Yes, thank you. I always take a deep breath when entering. But I do so out of respect for
Absolutely.
everyone who has come before us, right? And so let me first say that what I'm offering is one of many points of view. And they're not necessarily divergent points of view. There's a particular way in which I articulate this that has proven to be useful in continuing momentum amongst a diverse group of people, right? With different levels of appreciation and understanding for this work. And so I'm offering this as something that you can consider to have more effective conversations with your staff, boards, and other colleagues. And so for me, the most important thing that has been, that comes to mind in my experience of working with organizations, which I've done so for now over a decade, I can't believe that, is the emphasis is on whiteness, the construct of whiteness, not white people, the population of people who in conventional terms are associated with whiteness. Okay, so it's not a physical feature, it's a political and social construct that was created historically to confer advantage to a group of people, right, who had a certain set of physical identity traits, and to disadvantage, separate the more undesirable groups of people who didn't fit neatly into that identity from access to all types of resources that have contributed over time to what we understand as achievement gaps, wealth gaps, right? Health disparities, all of the types of things that we're hearing, criminal justice, and it's connected to the history of the United States, which is very domestically focused history, very unique in some ways, that includes the chattel slavery experience, right? And so because of that, whiteness, appreciating that whiteness is not about your actual identity. It's important to understand that as a Black male in leadership within an institution with positional power, I can actually perpetuate those characteristics. I can perpetuate whiteness as a Black male leader. Even though if you disaggregate your data and run your analysis, I represent the population that is probably most disproportionately impacted consistently across any area of focus. And so that's part of why this gets tricky, because it's not about your hearts. It's not about hearts and minds necessarily. It's about your practices and your policies in this context. And so when we talk to Sydney and family, can I just say family? I really mean it.
Say family. We already set the table, so come on.
Okay, thank you, thank you. And the meal looks great. When we talk to our colleagues on boards, our peers across different institutions, what we're really saying is, to what extent are we aware, are we cognizant of the ways in which our efforts, when we ask that question, to what end are we engaging in this? Is our response to change hearts and minds when we're really honest with ourselves? Or is our response that it is imperative that we dismantle the practices within this organization and the policies that are causing harm or eroding trust, and replace those with more humanizing ones policies that build trust, that build power amongst groups that have historically been marginalized, and that actually organize conversations in ways where collectively we incorporate more of that collective genius that I talked about. Right? And so understanding that there's a historical context in this is one of the ways in which we are practicing racial equity work, and we are working to dismantle white supremacy. So when you hear that term, dismantling white supremacy, it's acknowledging that before we can build anything, we have to remove what is taking up that space. Right? It's not about tweaking, it's about transforming. And so we have to do both. And the hearts and minds can be changed along the way. But when it comes to our grant making practices, we are looking at the structural underpinnings, the impact of inequitable practices, of inequitable grant-making norms that sometimes are violent, that exclude and marginalize groups and have done so historically.
I'm just going to pause there. You said it's not about tweaking, but transforming.
Yes, sir.
I think that would lead us to making sure that even as we talk about racial equity, that it is in the context of including everyone within at every cross section of racial equity. So I've heard you say that, you know, we can't really discuss racial equity and justice without being intentional about intersectionality or
Yes, sir.
intersecting identities of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Can you say more about this?
Thank you, Sidney. Thank you. And thank you for that pause too. I mean, that was, I can feel the energy. I can hear the voices from the people who speak through me. My mom, both of my parents have passed away. And my mom at 62 was the oldest. Like, she was the one to live the longest. But there are things that they have planted inside of me that through this work are expressed through me. And so I want to bring us all to I want us all to think about, in this moment, the person, allowed to be present with you in a way that you can sense the person or the set of people, the group of people who inspired you to do the work that you do today. Like, let's let them be a little more present in this conversation right now as I go into this question. And also I want everyone to, if you have a pencil or paper or something that you can draw with, take your pen, draw a circle, kind of smallest circle about the size of the O in my finger there, and put race, R-A-C-E. Okay, so a circle with race. You're drawing on your pencil, or you can imagine this too. But it's just an opportunity for us to do a little interactive thing together. Okay, so if you have race on your paper and you circled it, now draw lines that look like a sunburst. So from that circle, draw lines that go out, like a spoke in a wheel. And I'll hold up a picture of what mine looks like. I'm doing it with you. Okay. So this is real high-tech stuff. With the circle there with the race in the middle. That model that you have there is what we mean by centering race. Centering race means that regardless of how else you think about your work, so those other categories, those other areas that are connected to the circle, one of them will include gender. One of the variables that you do your data collection or analysis will include age. It'll include sexual orientation. It'll include your class level in terms of your wealth position. It'll include where you live, your geographic location. You want to have the most nuanced understanding of the people and populations that you serve to appreciate how different groups are experiencing the quality of life at any particular point in time in your area of focus, right? The reason we put race at the center of that is because the historical nature and the conversations of race have been so fraught that the first chance we get, race falls off the table and we replace it with something like class. And some of you may have even thought to yourself, well, isn't this really about class, right? Or isn't this really about some other distinguishing factor besides race? But what we're saying is when you center race, you always consider the extent to which racial history is significant, is relevant. And if it's not, then you can set it aside, but you've done the due diligence to ensure that the strategy, whatever strategy you develop on the back end, appropriately responds to the impact of inequity on racial groups. Right? And the last piece I'll say around this is, by centering race in this way, by incorporating this kind of analysis as a routine for your data collection and interpretation, then you can determine on a group-to-group basis the appropriate resources necessary to respond to their need and the amount. So it's not just the type. You identify that everyone needs a particular resource and they all get the same amount. No, people are faring differently, right? Different groups are having different experiences. And so the amount of resources you provide is actually related to the intensity of that experience.
So we're getting ready to, we're going to turn to the staff board and nonprofits conversation, which is at the core. But I just noticed a question in the chat box that you can decide whether or not you want to address it in the context of staff boards and nonprofits, or if you want to address it now. And that is, how do you broach the conversation when those who have been responsible for harm, albeit unintentionally, are seeking to do better, but don't acknowledge the harm that they created? Can you talk a bit about truth and reconciliation necessary in order to implement some of the practices? So you choose whether or not you want to do it now or in the context of.
I want to go right into this. And thank you so much, Jay, I believe it is, for offering that. The reason why this is important to talk about right now is because it can be the solitary factor that halts all conversation. It doesn't even matter if you know how to approach an effective conversation if you don't address this thing first. So let me offer it its due. And I'll offer it with leading with vulnerability, a concept that we sometimes talk about. I wonder if by hands, if any of you heard the conversations around vulnerability and the importance of leading with vulnerability, right? The reason I find that to be important is because there's a way in which we can lead with certainty. So much certainty that we have to wonder, well, why isn't anyone else as certain as you about the thing in which you're talking about? And so I want us to be super clear that we have not figured this out yet. We have not figured this out. So let's start there. And because of that, there's some very interesting realities that we can explore up front. One of which is that even Marcus, 10 years, more than 10 years, supporting other organizations through this work, is inadvertently moving in a way, making decisions, operating within GEO itself, supporting our internal progress and our external strategy in ways that are falling short of my highest aspirations. Even I am falling short of my own aspirations, right? The thing about that is, though, I'm aware that I don't know it all, and that the collective, the group, is critical to us identifying the gaps and making the proposals for responding to those gaps or any challenges in ways that is satisfactory to the entire group. And so what I'm saying to Jay is, if we set the been figured out yet, but there's plenty that we know, right? Then when there we go. Then when there's a perception that harm has occurred, we can name that this dynamic will surface along the way, and it is not only okay, but we want to minimize the impact of that, but we should anticipate it at some point in time. We can expect that our intentions will be different than our impact. So what we have an opportunity to do when we acknowledge the challenges is we can also name that it's important for us to have a system of reconciliation. Like, let's name what reconciliation looks like for this group as we move through the challenges, because it is a moving through. We are saying that if you want to dismantle these violent impacts, right, then we can't avoid tension or conflict. We actually have to move through it together. And it's the moving through that will build the trust that allows us to reconcile any harm, maybe perceived or real, within the process.
Thank you so much. I think that's you're right. I think addressing that at that moment is very useful. I think even as we lead into talking about boards, staff, and nonprofits. In your essay, which is excellent, I must say, hope is not a strategy for change. You note that doing this work requires us to frame the issue, focus on root causes, disaggregate data, which you talked about earlier, and exercise power. And so if we turn our attention initially toward boards, right? Boards who heretofore have seen themselves as, we're here for the fiduciary responsibility to the organization, policies, effectiveness, strategy, right? Boards that are volunteers for the most part, boards that are not in this day to day. What does, if you think about your essay and what we've talked about so far, what does this look like in working with boards and talking to boards about this?
Love it, thank you. One of the critical structural realities of boards is that they operate with privilege, positional power, right? They are the boss of the boss. And so it's critical that boards have an appreciation of the importance of reviewing the policies that govern the institution. Boards could actually, if intentional, ask the kinds of questions that generate the kinds of discussion on a staff level that can translate into proposals from staff for producing a more equitable culture and set of policies that govern the organization. So for example, my board chair is Kathy Reach from the Ford Foundation. And Kathy and I have very transparent, candid conversations about dynamics at any particular point in time within the organization or externally. She are my eyes out in the world to help us understand how being experienced by different stakeholders. If we have that kind of partnership, we can design agendas with this partnership. We can design agendas that cut to the heart of any blockages between staff and board, between board members of different generations. We can also surface unspoken challenges, which we talked about a little earlier, the unspoken barriers that are inhibiting our progress as an institution. And we can create space on the agenda to speak directly to those. And so embracing privilege, I know there are people who say, you know, there's a way in which sometimes we want to use a hammer on everything, for all issues, as opposed to screwdrivers. Like, we have to be very specific about how we view these different scenarios. But sometimes the conversation requires us to be tactical in ways that say, and surgical, to have a depth, to appreciate the sensitivity of identifying that all ways of being don't either fall into a white dominant cultural norm or an equitable one, right? So for example, hierarchy by nature isn't a white dominant cultural norm, or else we can eliminate hierarchy and then produce more equity through our ways of working, right? And so I'm saying we want to be intentional in our analysis. We want to consider what is the historical impact? To what extent is the issue that we're discussing in this moment actually creating the kinds of disparities or inequities or barriers to information, to resources of all kinds for people on this board or on staff or in the membership? And so the power within that body is critical, but there's some opportunities for real critical conversation as peers, right? So what is our learning agenda can be one of those questions for board members. And a learning agenda is just like a work plan. From January to December, what activities will we be engaged in that will increase our awareness and engage us in actions that allow us to apply what we're learning on a regular basis? Right? We can be intentional about structuring that, and the board can organize them in such a way that they make those kinds of commitments, participate with external resources, experts who can guide that process.
Great, great. So I'm just gonna pretend I'm a board member who, hears this, and you're leading grant makers for effective organizations. And I'm gonna turn it back on you and say, what does this have to do with effectiveness?
Woo.
I mean, we fund in communities that are predominantly Black. So what, help me out.
Everything. Like a fish in water asking, what is water? That's how I experience this thing. This is not about focusing on race. It's about centering racial equity. Racial equity is an analysis. It's a framework that you use to engage in conversations and relationships with all types of different people at different levels of positional power. It's a constant check on how am I showing up as a leader? Am I intellectually engaging you, or am I bringing my whole self into this conversation? One example of being that whole self, as I mentioned before, is about how much am I sharing, right? Am I just sharing what I know, or am I also talking about what I don't know and inviting others to inform those spaces? I am most effective when you are aware of what I know and what I don't know, and we are actively engaged in responding to both of those areas. Our institutions are no different. When we specialize in something and have developed expertise over time, where we understand patterns and we understand practices that have tended to yield promise consistently and reliably, that equals what we know. And a whole bunch of stuff that we do not know. And so as an institution, to also talk about the things that we don't know yet, but invite conversation around that, curate spaces for learning and practice, then we become effective. And so GEO has said, at least the leadership of GEO and the staff that supports this vision has said, Marcus, we got your back. We understand that the vision for this work is for us to build upon the 20 years of GEO being a place where you can learn about all of the things about being as a grant maker. And now we emphasize doing it. Now we apply it. Now we grapple with the challenges of implementation, but we do it in a way where GEO invites the experts in to work with you. We provide you with emotionally supportive spaces to be frustrated, to celebrate, to ask for help, to not know what the heck is going on, to feel like this was a mistake, to say, I didn't realize this involved so much and I don't know if I still want to do this, and to encourage you to keep going. That those feelings are actually indicators of progress. And this is why it's important for us to be together. You can't do this in isolation. So also that means that being effective means that we're well networked. And that's why we're part of this group today, having this important conversation.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So let's turn to talk about team members, staff. I think some of the, I think you did a really good job, even as you talked about governing boards in connecting breaking the silo and kind of connecting what's going on with the board, with the team, and with the leader. So that through line, that thread that you created, we're going to follow it now and kind of dig a little deeper specifically in how this shows up for teams. And anybody that's attempted to center race and has whether it's a completely diverse team or one that's not so diverse but has some members that are people of color, we all know that the best attempts at institutions being reflective and beginning this work can simultaneously cause pain and trauma for staff of color, right?
Yes.
The reality is we can't talk about white supremacy or racial equity. I'm putting that as a question, like, how can we talk about this in a way that addresses the very different needs of growth and healing for staff of color and staff who are white?
Whew. And we only have 17 more minutes.
No, we have time for question 6.
We I'm going to invite everyone to really slow down into this question. It's a complex question, and I may only get to part of it. And then if there's more, Sydney, I'm inviting you now to come back over the top with the additional piece of the question.
Yeah.
In the same way that we just distinguished whiteness from white people and centering race versus focusing on it, I want to go back to what it means to center whiteness in the context of these relationships. Even the term, for me, again, this is Marcus's point of view. For me, the more we separate ourselves, the less we're able to leverage the reality of this, in the saying that change happens at the speed of trust, right? It is my experience trust. When things happen, we just keep going. I'm back. The question was, how do we respond to this challenge with staff? And what I was starting to say is, we want to be aware of the extent to which we are centering whiteness, right? And replace that with something else. For example, the term POC as an identity is placing whiteness. It's saying you are something other than white. Even that creates the kind of dynamic that I believe is counterproductive, right? It has a practical sense. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm saying let's be aware of what we're doing. And it might be the best thing to do, for lack of a better term, right? Personally, I prefer to not use people of color because it positions us in such a way that one is other, right? White is other than this large group of people, and it also conflates the experiences and traditions of that entire group. When in reality, people of color is it's myriad organizations that make up a group of people of color, and each of those identities includes a historical background, a set of traditions, a set of spiritual beliefs, right? Cultural expressions, ways of being that in reality, the practice of racial equity and racial justice, liberation, is really about acknowledging our differences and celebrating them and making the most of them. It's about leveraging our differences. Our differences can be complementary, but it requires intentionality to coordinate them. And so to whatever extent we can, there we go. To whatever extent we can be intentional in our efforts to define our focus away from whiteness as the standard, then we are creating a different type of experience. We are actually dismantling the destructive impact of whiteness by not letting that be the center of how we define all realities. I hate to sound so esoteric, but it's very practical too, but it's a principle. Replace it with humanity. What is our collective humanity? And then how do we identify experiences from that? Well, as a human being, I have to ask you, what do you prefer to be? How do you prefer to be called? So when we talk about pronouns, right, that's an example of how we're doing it. We're not centering our white cultural norms. We're saying, what do you prefer to be called? And we're acknowledging that whatever that person says, we're agreeing to refer to them as that. Like, that type of agreement allows us to engage each other in a different way. And we can institutionalize those practices. It is what I like to refer to as a generational commitment to generational change for generational impact. Why is it a generational commitment? Because you cannot, in a training or 2 or 4, become a racially equitable, anti-racist organization. You can't, in 3 or 4 years, do that either, right? So to the extent that we can set the table for boards and staff and colleagues, leaders of organizations, and help them understand that this requires a long-term view, where the end goal is actually establishing a shared vision, a common vision for our organization, based upon agreements that identify us as we really are, and not compared to some standard that we were all socialized into promoting, which is what whiteness is. It's a historical thing, political in nature, that we've been socialized into through story, through mythology, through reinforcement, right? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps is not a reality. We need each other to be successful. Every person who is successful can thank someone else for helping them out, providing them with an opportunity, which they were then responsible for leveraging and making the most of, right? So when we dismantle the mythology, demystify this process, get down to our collective humanity, and agree upon how we interact from there, that's where we start. And there's no checklist for this. That's what I'm saying. And there's things we don't know yet. There's no checklist, but the group can determine what is right for me, for them, for us.
Yeah.
It's for us to determine. You doing all right, Sydney?
Yeah, I'm doing fine. I am doing fine.
Me too.
Yeah,
I even see an amen over here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that going, like, literally this idea of embracing individual humanity and really understanding, not making any assumption or categorizing our teams, but really paying specific attention to the individual kind of interests and needs as you go through this collectively as an organization is critical.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
And that's what I've seen. Yeah.
Please allow me this moment to model.
Yeah.
I hope you experience as vulnerable leadership.
Yeah.
I'm saying in front of this group right now.
Yeah.
I have fallen short of my own expectations in every category of leading GEO. And that's despite all of the advancements that we have made, right? The vision, the narratives, the strategies, the engagements, the conversations, the board development, the breakthroughs, transformation, transformative experiences that still fall short of our real desire for change. Why is that? Because it's been so many years, so many generations of this problem recurring. And so the more we allow human beings to grapple and struggle with the pain of this recurring impact that reinforces doubt, reinforces cynicism, reinforces tears, it's traumatic. It's traumatic. COVID in this moment disproportionately impacting our family members because of all of these kids that have structural underpinnings, right? Why would staff be satisfied with a cute article that is true, or some op-eds, or some momentum of our, right? It's not enough, and it's not going to be enough. So as a leader, I am adapting to a reality that says, you know, maybe nothing that I ever do will actually be enough. And to what extent can I be okay with that and do it anyway? It's so important for me to be able to say this. We can do this together.
Yeah.
Only together can we do this. No board, no individual staff person, no solitary organization will support the level of transformation that generations of people who have been excluded and marginalized are yearning for. And for our counterparts who have benefited from white privilege, you too have been underserved because our standard is way too low. The standard for everyone in this country is too low. We can do better. I told you, you set a hell of a table, and I appreciate the family. This is important. We can do this. Look at how everybody is moved. We're on Zoom. It's tears.
This is the work. This is it.
This is the work. So thank you, Sydney.
I think that
Brave space.
Thank you for being in the family, right? I think this is what has been missing in, if I can say my opinion, in philanthropy for so long. We, quote unquote, can do it. But it starts with setting the table and creating space to be vulnerable and truthful and affirm each other's humanity. And figure out how the hell we're gonna make this better.
This is the only thing I trust. This we. There's nothing that separates us now. I'm so confident about that, and you all feel it too. Now we can get to some tricky conversations.
Yeah.
This is what gives me hope, and this is what I've experienced over that decade of practice that made me believe like, wow, maybe if I put myself out there in a platform like Geo offers and dare to step out into the unknown and invite others into this, maybe we can start to define a collective, a common vision for effectiveness and thriving for ourselves, for the communities that we serve. It's happening. You're setting the table for that. This is it. Thank
you. We are gonna go to questions. I promise you I'm gonna do it. But I want to give you a moment to kind of connect the circle, right? When the institutions allow vulnerability in their spaces so that we can be honest, truthful, open, and be ourselves to advance and center racial equity, right? In pursuit of that great aspirational vision of liberation where we're not even employed by trying to deal with this.
That's right. That's right.
We can't talk about that without talking about our relationships and the power dynamics between funder and nonprofits, right?
That's right.
And so my question is like, how do you, in your experience, like, how can institutions be more vulnerable, like collectively, in relationship with nonprofits, also working with them to center equity as well?
Yeah.
Racial equity as well.
Yeah. Well, you just said it. We work with them to center equity, right? We set tables. I didn't realize how much this would be such a powerful thing. But the idea of setting a table is like you're using your positional power as an institution to invite people into the space for something similar to what happened today to occur, right? We're asking questions. The not knowing that I talked about is asking others what they think about the stuff. We specialize in this. What do you think about the things that we know to be promising? And also, oh, by the way, there's a couple of things that we're really curious about. What has been your experience, nonprofit grantee partners? What has been your experience, Ms. Johnson, who works with one of the nonprofits, right? The feedback that we get from that, the feedback loops, right? I think Hewlett Foundation talks a lot about feedback and how we incorporate that into our work, right? Trust-based philanthropy, same way. Taking the unknowns to our grantees and inviting them as partners to respond to those unknowns is how we start to design in ways that are customized, right? Like I said before, there's no checklist. We can be confident in our partnership when we move beyond transactional, strictly transactional relationships, right? Of course, we can make transactions all day, but if that's the only thing that defines the relationship, then it never goes beneath the surface, right? And again, the goal, the end goal is change, right? The transaction may be charitable in nature, but in order to go from charity to change, it requires us establishing a relationship with those partners that goes beyond those set of transactional questions, expectations. And what is that? That is actually then incorporating their vision into the common vision that we are defining in real time. Again, we all know how to do this. We know how to relate to each other. It's that the structural barriers of our institutions become barriers because we believe that we are supposed to perform in certain ways that have become traditional or appropriate. Instead of appropriate, what if we allow ourselves, we dare ourselves to be audacious, right? This is an audacious conversation, but we can also just be practical. A practical conversation just engages you up here. I feel like we're all in this together. And that's what I believe from the nonprofit space. Nonprofits are doing the work. They are on the streets. They're the ones right now who don't know if their doors will be open several months from now. And so I suspect, and I'm being very facetious right now, I usually don't do that. Emphasis, I'm saying, I suspect if you ask someone whose doors are about to close in a few months, what their experience is, they will have a lot to say that will shape how we prioritize our work and allocate our resources. We can set the table and allow for that to happen.
Yeah. So I'm going to pause for a moment. I certainly, if for any reason there's not questions, there are no questions. I have more. I have plenty for you. But I want to pause. I want to make sure that I offer this space, since we've set the table, for the guests at the table, all the guests at the table, to ask questions as well. So in any of the channels that we have today, are there questions? I don't see any in the chat, but any of the other areas, Kathy, or?
There are quite a few questions in the anonymous Google form. I don't know that we'll get to all of them today, but we can start with the first one.
Great.
What would you suggest are some best practices for philanthropic organizations to look introspectively to examine and identify our own microaggressions and issues of systemic racism that exist within our often well-meaning institutions?
Yeah, you know, I'm always curious about the people who are making this observation, whether there are ideas that they have, right? And it's not to turn the question back on the asker, but it is like, it's something, there's a sensitivity that has been triggered, right, in that question that says, like, I've observed something that is amiss. And so I'm so curious to engage with the people who observe those things. Having said that, the practices that I've seen the most involve bringing in external expertise, right? One of the biggest mistakes, a mistake might be too certain of a term. Again, we need to watch our certainty. One of the biggest steps that may not necessarily serve in work is that we get a training and then we attempt to keep the organization moving on our own, right? Without the support of an external facilitator. I think there's an opportunity for us to have these conversations convened. So caucusing, for example, is one way. Anonymous, opportunities for anonymous feedback loops, right? Whether that's surveying, whether that's third-party engagements, whether that's partnering with other organizations. So why does it only have to be one regional association? What if 3 of us organized a shared conversation and the members of each of those regional associations compiled their own lessons and experiences? Like, I think what I'm saying is this is about engaging communities. For example, Geo right now, in the next month or so, you'll all be invited to review this, our latest publication for what's called community philanthropy, right? Mm-hmm. Kind of this idea of engaging the communities that we're serving to inform how we do our work. Well, the same thing, I think, the same rules apply to when harm is caused or when we unintentionally operate in ways that are self-defeating. We have to have the relationships in place for staff to be able to respond to the need, right? To say we are observing something that is not working, to feel in reality that there will be no retaliation for naming it, right? Oh, this person, they're always saying the thing and then they get in trouble, ends up on their performance review or something like that. And we want to show the work. So the GO staff is really good about these norms. And one of them is, as you do your work, also show your work. And I'm learning this. Like, I can come up with this great strategy, but they want to know, like, oh, like, help us understand the rationale behind that thing. Just kind of communicate differently. So this idea of being adaptive as a leader is another very specific practice. So to summarize, caucusing, using external expertise, not just for training, but over a longer period of time to support implementation. Let's call it coaching. And also then using this community informed, making sure that the mechanisms that are in place allow for feedback loops to occur, not just one way, but both ways. And then that information show how it is applied in real time. It's a process, it takes time to do this well, but we have to stumble through just like we do anything else and start where we are.
Great. Next question, Kathy.
How do you navigate this work when the largest barrier to any progress is a well-intentioned, self-unaware philanthropic leader who wants to avoid a discussion and focus on racial justice and wants to take a social justice / general approach that dilutes the work that could be done?
Say that one for me again. I heard a couple of different things in that.
How do you navigate this work when the largest barrier to any progress is a well-intentioned, self-unaware philanthropic leader who wants to avoid a discussion and focus on racial justice and wants to take a social justice / general approach that dilutes the work that can be done?
Okay. This is great. And Sydney, you jump in here too. I'm noticing there's a pattern of kind of like this person. What about this person who is so ignorant kind of a thing, right? This is about organizational mission. This work is about our mission, critical commitment as board, staff, organizational representatives. The work of an individual is just that. Like, we all have our individual work to do. Like I said, changing hearts and minds. Right? We want that to happen. It is imperative, though, that the work of the organization, right, occurs in the most effective way possible, whether you change your heart or mind or not. Right? This is about execution of the mission. It's not devoid of the experience of the people. It's inclusive of the experience of the people. And so we can be intentional about both, right? Offering the support and the space for staff, for individuals. Again, if we have the feedback loops in place, if we're looking at our internal infrastructure, if we're bringing in the outside expertise to help us develop what some are calling a race equity culture, others call it inclusive workforce culture, right, workplace, then we're getting proposals for tweaks that we can make, for changes that we can make within the organization. It just requires that kind of leadership, right? We talked about that hopefully we demonstrated on this call, that is willing to adapt, that to try different things. It is continual learning that drives the work, because you're not going to get it right in the short run. No one has. You can ask for as many best practices as you want. I wish someone would tell me, like, show me the webinar with the group that has figured this all out. It does not. It doesn't mean that we haven't learned things along the way. We have. There are great organizations to check in with, but they'll tell you, most of the leaders that I've spoken with of organizations that have done really good work, grant-making organizations, they feel like they haven't done enough. They feel comfortable being seen as the model organization, right? And so I say all of that to say, if we focus too much on individual conversion, then we may miss the the execution of our mission. We may miss all these other opportunities to advance our vision in service of the mission, right? And it still is an opportunity for us to, as board members perhaps, to say, you know what, we think it would be really good for Marcus to work with an executive coach, in which his emotional intelligence is actually a barrier to him being more effective in his role. And we see that it's having an impact on staff. So that's I'm saying that's a responsibility for trustees. My understanding is that trustees, like everyone else, have day jobs. It's not necessarily staff going above the executive director's head to, you know, to undermine the authority, as much as different stakeholders offering feedback from different spaces to provide a fuller picture of how leadership is showing up on behalf of the organization and in service of the mission.
So I have one here, and it's related to boards as well. What guidance do you have for those who are having success in discussing white supremacy on a diverse board and staff level, but are facing bigger tensions when talking about anti-Blackness and or Black Lives Matter? When there's a jostling for making sure everyone's identity group is included.
Yeah, I mean, this is naming the stuff, right? This is the gray space. And as I said before, I actually don't know that we have evolved as a sector. I have not seen a critical mass of brave spaces. If I were to make an assessment overall of the sector, the results would be that we're just kind of moving out of diversity as our focus.
Yeah.
We're still pretty much just browning up spaces, right? Making sure that we have leaders of diverse ethnic backgrounds and making sure that the gender mix is not all male. And so there's just a long, wet road to hoe. And there's a network of philanthropy serving organizations and regional associations that could coordinate in such a way that if we step outside of our traditional ways of doing business, we can create more brave spaces for these conversations to take place. So I'm saying that the question is getting to the heart of a major structural barrier. And currently, there aren't enough brave spaces to respond to it. However, challenging philanthropy serving organizations like GEO, like the Council on Foundations, like Independent Sector, like the United Philanthropy Forum,
to the network,
right? All of those that we can keep going. We can keep going.
Keep going.
Friends. because I know these friends are actively engaged in these conversations.
Yeah.
Challenge us to create the kind of resources that are useful for you as practitioners. Don't just fall for the stuff that kind of sounds good. It makes you feel like you know as much as everyone else and then be satisfied with that. No, I would say raise the bar. I said earlier, the bar for all of us is too low, including those people that we have associated with benefiting the most from privilege. The bar is way too low. Same as in philanthropy. We have to focus on structural change. And let me say something more practical.
Please.
Excuse me. Our nonprofit grantee spaces are buzzing with innovative work that is very focused on issues, on campaigns, on advocacy, on moving policy. The extent to which we are more intentional about connecting our work with those efforts, leveraging those efforts, coordinating our strategies to support and advance those efforts, I think is also generates that kind of movement. We don't have to get into the intellectual exchanges around how we define justice or equity or this or that, as much as what is the work out there that is producing results that are generating, fostering thriving communities, that are strengthening nonprofits in ways that are helping us produce the kinds of results that we associate with equity, right? The work of foundations can be aligned with that with more intentionality.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, we can be a little more courageous in the extent to which we give those organizations doing that important work more money, just straight up flexible funding without all of the barriers, the jumping through the hoops. And I understand every foundation is different, and yet there are some things about each of us that are similar, right? To what extent can we challenge ourselves to expedite that process and support the work that's demonstrating the most progress?
Yeah. Kathy, do you have another one?
There are a lot. How do you respond to the idea that people are products of their time and we should not hold past actions to our present standards? This is a common pushback to anti-racist work, and I struggle to find a response that acknowledges the product of their time fact, but still lets us advance the discussion.
I love it. I love it. Again, let's break this down a little bit. Whether a person is a product of their time or not doesn't really matter when it comes to your institution. Your institution, some institutions are almost 100 years old. So we're holding them to a different kind of a standard that's very contemporary, but it's tied to mission again. So the individual as a leader, there's a way in which adaptive leadership characterizes this moment. Technology is changing. So many things are changing in the way that we live as individuals. Right now we're on Zoom. 7 years ago, thank goodness this didn't happen sooner. We would not have this as a tool. Right? And so what I'm saying here is there will always be the barrier of our individual limitations, which is why it's important for us to be networked, to operate as a community in concert with others who share mission, vision, aspiration. Because my shortcomings will then be filled with one of you. Someone else will have a complementary set of assets that we can employ to respond to situations as they emerge. We actually need responsiveness. The focus on racial equity or on race is tripping us up, and that is why it was created. We keep falling for it over and over again. It is not real. There's no biological reality to the racial distinctions that characterize our identities. It is truly a social and political construct that has history to it. So it's important for us to be clear about the history. Some of you understand what policy backstories are. It means understanding, if we're talking about child welfare, how decisions from the 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s, and so on created the conditions of the child welfare system today, right? We can do that kind of policy backstory or policy analysis on every issue that we grapple with in philanthropy. And individuals are no different either. Okay, I was raised in the 70s, socialized to believe at a time when it was good enough to be colorblind. People thought like, yeah, in the 80s, if you were colorblind, you were doing well because diversity was the charge of the day. Well, guess what? That evolved. We learned something from that focus. And what we learned is that being neutral, race neutral, actually it dehumanizes me. When you don't acknowledge that I'm a Black male, that I grew up in the Midwest, that both of my parents are deceased, that all of the things that go along with my story actually are relevant to how I can show up and what my needs are. And so let's take it away from the individual and whether they believe this or that. And what we're saying is, what's the analysis? So are you using, for example, a racial equity impact analysis for your work? Are you engaging the community that you serve in the design and conceptualization of your programming? Are we creating feedback loops for staff input and participation in conversations that inform the strategy of our organization? What I write, what I listed, and Sydney mentioned in the piece, "Hope is not a strategy for change," is that yes, we can want all types of things, and there's some very concrete steps we can take to tip the scales to be more likely to produce results that get us closer to equity, and understand that that's not good enough, that we have to continue to learn and innovate around those findings.
Great.
So it's generational because it's going to take us trying some things, doing assessments, learning from those things, and trying other things.
Time for one more question.
Okay, this one's short. How do you even start these conversations with people who don't know they are the problem?
Well, that's kind of loaded. I would offer, like, this problem goes beyond any individual, right? We all bring emotional baggage, vestiges from our experiences that are counterproductive to our efforts, right? The important thing to center here is, what is the process that we're using to advance our work? And to what extent are we incorporating race-informed strategies, right? I today have talked about racial equity analysis as some very concrete pieces we can use, and the tools that go along with that to produce certain results through our grant-making work. What I'm hearing is a real appreciation for the relationships within organizations. And that's slightly different. That is, there are bodies of work around race that have to do with racial healing. So let me take one more. I'm gonna do one more big,
Yes.
like, let's get real. Marcus Walton, separate from Geo, my personal is that the salvation of this country lies in reconciliation with those past harms. In the same way that South Africa engaged in a truth and reconciliation process, imagine if this country adopted a similar process and adapted it to respond to all of these questions. Some of the questions sound like the same question asked in different ways.
Yeah.
But but people are feeling like they are invisible because we're not fully hearing each other. We're not really being present with each other. And as leaders, we're leading with resentment. We don't want to be challenged, especially, and there's these narratives out there that the millennials are this way and that way. Listen, let me say this on the record. Thank God for them for challenging the processes that we've been using for years and years ineffectively, right? Someone has to disrupt what we're doing in order for us to adopt a different set of ways of doing things. Now, sometimes those critiques are misdirected at individuals, right? But again, it's human beings in this work. Can we offer compassion and take the, like, let's extract the truth from the stuff that's truthful. Come on. We've been in this game for a long time. For those of us who have been involved in this for several years, yes, we have to support each other. It's emotionally draining sometimes to feel like you're taking hits from people who are critiquing your work. And it's not about us. It's not about me. It ain't about you. It's not. It's about how much we perpetuate the things that got us here. If I believe that the ways of approaching this work that got me into this role right now will get me to where I want to be, then shame on me. Shame on me. We already know it doesn't work like that. Yeah. It requires me to shift, to make shifts, to show up differently as a leader. And Zoomer, I love this. I love the chat over here. Please look at the chat. It's amazing. So yeah, we're reimagining a different way of being.
Yeah.
And through this process, we will all be changed. And let's just change for the better. Let's agree that we want to change for the better. It's okay.
Yeah. There's two things I want to add to that, but I want to acknowledge, part of it is that even at 88 minutes into a 90-minute conversation, there are 110, now 109 people that are engaged in this conversation. And I am a firm believer, to your point earlier, and it's not about, proselytizing or bringing those who are not, necessarily aligned with the mission at the moment, but really honoring that you have enough with those who are on the table, who are at the table, who are willing and who are open. You always have enough to create the change that you need to see. That's one. And I think the other one is to your last point, almost the last sentence you just said, is that, the role of imagination in this work, the role of being able to disrupt by virtue of imagining a different way of being. We've been restricted so much from our frameworks and what we've been taught about how to do this and how to do that, and that in many ways we've lost the imagination, the ability to simply sit and imagine a different state of being. And I hope that today and the work certainly that you're doing and that Gio's doing and that we're attempting to do, and that as we've talked, two of us have talked, hope to even to do more formally together.
Yes.
That if nothing else, that we have the opportunity to try to bring back imagination and bring back the opportunity of people to imagine everyone free. Imagine those ideals we talked about at the very beginning, the gaps being closed, and that those words actually mean something for everyone. And so I'm just thankful for 90 minutes plus of your time, plus yesterday, where we were in preparation for the day, and we were saying, somebody was like, did they record that? Like, look, we're just going to have a conversation. I think that and I'm appreciative of your work, but I will leave you with closing remarks on your end, and then we'll close out. Anything that you have to add or want to leave us with?
Well, I'm just humbled. I am leaving this conversation not the same person that I entered as, and I appreciate that. And by allowing a space, a brave space again, and really offering those challenging questions, like you took us up on that offer and made this thing real. You have helped me transform and become more of the person that I want to be.
Yeah,
and ultimately,
same.
That's amazing. So thank you all, and let's do the work. Let's spread this, spread the word. Let's do it. Let me know what we need to do. I want to hear the proposals and the inside. Do the survey. Absolutely. Please do the survey so that we can that.
Well, thank you. Please join me in thanking Marcus for joining us today. Please be on the lookout. This is, as we say, this is continuing to be the start, and looking forward to working with you all going forward. This time matters, and this time we're going to get this right. Have a wonderful rest of your day. I took 1 extra minute of your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sydney. Congratulations.